All right, what's going on, guys? So, one common talking point that I've been hearing is this idea that necromancy is really bad for the economy and necromancy ruined the economy. This didn't feel right or this didn't sound right. And just, I've played the game at a pretty high level and I've done a lot of these bosses. I've sold a lot of these items. So, this didn't feel correct to me. So I did a lot of research into the numbers, and here, the numbers you see on screen, these are all of the values of everything 3 months before the release of Necro and 3 months after the release of Necro. Now, this is just an arbitrary value that I picked. It could be a good measure of stability. It could be a bad one, depending. I don't really know. This is just the value that I picked, so I will admit right now that this is a potential limitation of this data, is that if these values aren't actually stable 3 months before and 3 months after, then this data might not be as meaningful, right? So I will admit that up front because I'm sure that's going to be one of the big comments I'm going to get is, oh, this is not good for whatever reason. So just figured I'd say that now, just to get that out of the way. But yeah, I'm going to link this document in the description. So if you want to just look through these numbers yourself, again, I pulled all these numbers from le.gg so you can verify all these numbers yourself. For rares and discontinued items and hero items, le.gg, I've heard a lot of criticisms about how they doctor a lot of their numbers. But for stuff like Bo the Last Guardian and Fractured Staff, it was the only place where I could find any data. So again, it is possible that all of these values are doctored. I bought a Bo the Last Guardian for 5.6 bill, so it wouldn't surprise me if 3 months before Net Necro came out, it was 5.1. That just makes sense to me. So because I was purchasing a lot of these items, I'm more inclined to trust these numbers. But again, if you don't trust these numbers, then you're welcome to look up numbers on whatever website you prefer. My guess is you're going to get relatively similar data to this. So the biggest standouts are Bo the Last Guardian dropping by 40%, Eldritch Crossbow dropping by 42.5%, and then basically every magic item dropping by 50%. Magic got nuked. It's pretty bad. It's really hard to consider Magic anything but a worse moneymaker after the update. Seismic dropped by 60%. Prey Souls dropped by 52.5%. Magma Tempest dropped by 41%. Crypt Boon dropped by 53%. Magic took a pretty big L in terms of the value of their gear. On the opposite end, the skilling items from Croceus, which I am including because Crypt Bloom is gear, and in order to get Crypt Bloom, you ran the consequence of getting Scriptures of Bic, Taga's Core Hammer, and Sans Fire Torch a non-zero number of times. So that's why I included these, and they will be included in the final calculations. I also talked about Tectonic Energy, Malevolent Energy, and Ancient Scales, as these were a relatively common item to be farmed because they are consistent money. They won't be included in the final calculations because how much of these you could get is relatively arbitrary. There is, a standard amount that you could get. For instance, Ancient Scales on average, you should get 14.4, but valuing, one Ancient Scale just didn't make a whole lot of sense, so I didn't bother with that. Also, the tier 90 shields are effectively worthless now. There's no reason to use them ever. Consequently, if you're doing rots, you did make less money, period. It's pretty much all there is to it. Although, because these prices are 3 months after and not now, Malevolent Energies are like $1 million now. So Rots is probably fine money. All of that said, when you look at all of these numbers and you add them all together, you get a basket of goods that is high-end gear. And high-end gear as a collective dropped by about 35.5%. Most of this loss is coming from your magic items, but again, Bo the Last Guardian and Eldritch Crossbow did take pretty substantial losses. Now, some items did go up, mainly the skilling drops, Greater Fury, Greater Barge, Vestments of Havoc, Grimoire, and Scripture of Full. But those are the big notes to take away, is that anything that dropped important magic gear, that gave you way less money than all the items that dropped. So, okay, everything dropped by around 35.5%. That sounds bad. Something else to keep in mind is that Raciel's gear also came out with Necromancy. 3 months after the fact, these were the prices, and the GP per hour at the time was around 120 mil. Why is this number important? So this number is important because when we think about the value of our gear, prior to Necromancy coming out, it was just all gear against itself. Meaning, okay, if I sell a Bow of the Last Guardian piece, I get a certain amount of money. That money can buy me this amount of gear for the other styles. With the introduction of an entirely new economy, which is Raziel's gear and Necromancy gear, when we think about how that compares to the other gear, we need to do a direct comparison. So because the basket of goods that is all of the other gear dropped by around 35%, that means if we sell Raziel's gear, which is worth about 120 mil per hour, and bought non-necromancer gear with it, we were actually getting an effective 186 mil per hour. Now, this effective number is just referring to, okay, if we use Raziel's gear to buy what the gear was worth, 6 months ago, this is about how much money we would be getting. Something else to consider is that at the time, 4 Zamorak per hour at 2k in Rage was pretty much the hard cap, and this was around 120 mil per hour, and 2449 claims at Telos was also around the same value. So Raziel was significantly more accessible, and you could use Raziel's gear to buy the other gear that took this big drop. So in terms of the amount of stuff you could buy by selling your Raziel gear and buying other gear, this was by far the best effective moneymaker by more than 50%, which is an insane number. I won't go as far as say that farming Raziel is the best moneymaker that's ever existed, but at least in recent RuneScape history, this is the strongest moneymaker that we've been able to make. Obviously, right now, there are theoretical methods that are pretty good. So I believe 4K in Rage, 200% claims at Telos is like 250 mil an hour. And then we can get 6-minute Zamorak kills now. So 6-minute Zamoraks is 9 Zamoraks an hour. That's like 270 mil an hour. So it's definitely not as good as that. But Raziel, around the release of Necro, this was an incredible money-making method. Not only because it was competitive with the other money-making methods, but because its gear was separate from the economy of the other gear that all dropped because of the release of Raziel's gear. Another thing to consider is that the value of our trash loot basically stayed the same. All alkables and cash stayed the same for obvious reasons, but also just trash loot at this time has been relatively stable, where your bolt tips, these are pretty much pegged to their alk price, your bolts, your dust, this is all going to be pegged to your alk price, and herb prices are just relatively stable in general, seed prices are relatively stable. So because our trash loot is constant, but our uniques went down, what this means is that our trash loot, in terms of the amount of stuff you can buy by selling your trash loot, is 35.5% more. This is the same value that, your items dropped by. So what does this mean? This means that bosses that drop a lot of trash loot or a lot of guaranteed drops, so Rise of the Six, Solak, Zamorak, and Karapak are the big ones that come to mind. I'm sure there are others, but those are just the ones I thought about as I was writing this up. Those are going to be significantly less affected because even if their big drops ended up going down, because their trash loot is worth about the same or worth even more, something to consider is that your effective buying power is actually a little bit more from these bosses than it is from other bosses. So a boss like Raksha is going to feel a lot worse because even if your trash loot is staying the same, so much of your money, almost all of your money, was coming from your greater chain and your greater ricochet that you basically only really felt the drop in your top end. You don't really feel your trash loot being more effective. The last thing to keep in mind is that any GP that came from non-PVM sources is completely unaffected by the change of PVMing gear, meaning that if you're doing clues or if you're skilling for money, that money buys 35.5% more gear than it did before. So why do so many people say that Necro feels really bad for the economy and that Necro ruined everything? The biggest reason is that it's really hard to feel a lot of these granular increases and decreases in effective value of GP. So if Karapak's big drops are going down by 40%, but your trash loot is staying the same, all that we really feel on our end is, oh, this is 40% worse. But that's not really true. Because Karapak's biggest drops went down by around 40%, but his trash loot is more effective. What ended up happening is that Karapak's effective GP per hour, at least 3 months after the release of Necro, was about the same, or very slightly worse, very slightly better. It's about a wash in terms of the effective change that happened. The other thing to consider is that it may be true that depending on the type of gear you were farming and what you were buying with it, it is true that your GP per hour was significantly worse. If you were doing a lot of AOD and, let's say you were going dry on codices, but you were getting, more weapons, your weapons are way worse. Like, that's undeniable. So, if you were getting your AOD weapons, or if you were doing a lot of ED3, or if you were doing a lot of Virago, then the gear you were buying is the gear that didn't drop as much. So you're trying to buy your Vestiments, your Langs, your EZK, then you were effectively making less money than you were before. The same thing is also true where if you're high rolling on items that dropped a lot and you're buying items that didn't drop as much, then yeah, you were getting a little bit less money. If 3 months after Necro came out, you got back-to-back bow pieces, or you got bow piece, staff piece, that bought you less general stuff than it did 6 months ago, right? So there are things to keep in mind when doing this math, because it's not as clear cut as, oh, well, because the basket of goods dropped by this much, but also there is this new moneymaker, then actually our money is worth more. It's not necessarily that clear cut. While it is true in a general sense, what it does mean is that if you were the type of player who Ambassador and Virago are your favorite bosses, you were hurting from the Necromancy update. Like, it's bad. That's all there is to say about it. It's not good. However, if you were keeping any of the drops that you were getting, you're basically exclusively benefiting, because that bow piece, instead of you selling it and buying other stuff, you're just keeping it, which means all that matters is the trash loot, and your trash loot is worth more money than it was before, or it's worth more effective GGP rather. So if you were farming items that you needed, then this is just exclusively better for you. Like, there's basically no downsides, at least if you're buying PVM gear, which we'll talk about a little later. The other reason that Necromancy's effects on the economy feel so bad is that there are a group of players who do feel bad, and they're right to feel bad. And these are your top of the top line players, where these are players that have all of the gear in the game and they boss so that they can sell their gear to buy Hazelmere's signet ring and Tavia's fishing rod and party hats and Halloween masks and your exclusive holiday items and your treasure hunter rewards for the cool cosmetics. All of those items either stay the same or keep going up, and the stuff that we would sell to buy those items went down. So if you're that top 0.001% player who is, 100 bill bank, and you really like PVMing and that's your preferred method of money making, you don't really like merching that much. If you're that player, yeah, your money is worth a lot less. The other group of players that's affected is people who were just sell their PVM drops to buy anything, not just exclusively PVM upgrades. So if you sell your PVM drops and you buy a Taga's Core Hammer, your PVM drops, you're spending more now for a variety of reasons. Not only is Taga's Core Hammer more expensive, but the items that you're selling to get the Taga's Core Hammer are less expensive, right? So you're spending way more now to get a Taga's Core Hammer than you were 3 months for Necromancy. Same thing is true for just other skilling stuff in general. There are players who are correct. Their money is worth less. But this is a relatively niche group of players. I'm just not that concerned with them making less money, right? I'm rich. I have all of the gear in the game. My money being worth a little bit less just doesn't matter, because whenever a new thing comes out, if I'm going for Golden Reaper, which I am, I'm just going to farm it anyways. So the price of stuff doesn't matter to me. I'm totally unaffected by the economy in a lot of ways. Now, again, If you're a regular player who's, buying a little bit of skilling stuff here, buying a little bit of PVM drops here, only doing PVMing for your money, so you're not doing clues, you're not skilling for money, then yeah, I could see, because you're buying a lot of skilling stuff and just, bonds, for instance, that the economy feels a little bit worse. But the reality is that it's probably not bad enough unless you're buying very little PVM gear for you to really notice it. Now, it doesn't mean that it doesn't feel worse, but whether or not it's actually worse, it's probably nowhere near as bad as you feel like it is. Now, there are limitations to this data, and it's not necessarily foolproof in the sense that, oh, this is definitive proof that necromancy is actually good for the economy. Again, it depends on the type of player you are. If you are buying non-PVM gear with your PVM drops, your GP is less effective. That's just true. So this includes bonds, this includes skilling equipment, and it includes your cosmetics and your rare, so your party hats, stuff like that. Selling PVM drops to buy those items is worse now than it was before, period. I don't consider supply costs in this because generally we sell our trash loot to buy supply costs. So I would consider it a wash. But again, this could be considered a limitation where maybe I am underselling how much trash loot is worth now because, we're not considering how the cost of PVMing is still the same. Even if that were the case, I would say that this means that our GP is worth a little bit less, but still not, less than 1. It's going to be definitely a multiplier before in a necro, just not as extreme of a multiplier, if that makes sense. I already talked about the 3-month time period before and after being a potential limitation. It also doesn't take into account Vorkath, which was another pretty huge moneymaker. If we're going to include Vorkath in the basket of goods and we're going to consider it part of necromancy, Vorkath was an insane amount of GP per hour if you could kill it effectively in the first couple of months and weeks. When spikes were like 10 mil each, you could pretty easily bring in 11 spikes an hour. And then including your trash loot, including the chance to roll for Lord of Bones, Vorkath was insane GP per hour on release. And this happened, the week after this 3-month time period. So if we include that in, it just makes our money worth even more than it was before. So that's worth considering. And then this data also doesn't account for the trade tax coming out right before the Necro update. The removal of that did a lot for the prices of some of these more expensive items. It is hard to know how much it mattered. So it's hard to know how much the trade tax made Bow the Last Guardian go down. And it's hard to know if it made it go down at all. We know that it negatively impacted the price of rares, but it's really hard to know exactly how much of this accounts for that type of thing. Beyond that, it doesn't take into account some of the issues, meaning Sanctum of Rebirth released and obliterated the prices of seismics and appraisals, mostly because there are tier 95s that do a thing and seismic appraisals don't do a thing. Additionally, Sanctum has a botting issue where it is being pretty ruthlessly botted right now and it doesn't seem like anything is being done about it. And Raciel has an AFK method, meaning you can AFK like 60 mil an hour right now, which is concerning and should probably be dealt with, but maybe it shouldn't be. I don't really know. It doesn't count for any of those because those things happened either way after or in a way that's unrelated to necromancy. So I didn't want to account for those. It also doesn't take into account the effects of the combat beta and the impact that had on the combat meta and what it did for prices. Generally, the combat beta made stuff go up for melee. It was about a wash for ranged, and magic stuff kept going down because it was already bad. Now, by excluding that data, I am also taking the risk of downplaying some of necromancy's long-term effects. But again, I feel like this data was enough to show that, okay, the things that we can attribute strictly to necromancy doesn't seem to be bad for the economy unless you're one of these players, right? If you're a player who already has everything, which is probably the players who are complaining the most, then yeah, your money is worth less, but you have everything, so I don't care. And if you're a player that buys bonds and skilling gear and just stuff to raise your stats, your money is probably worth a little bit less or around the same or a little bit more. It's hard to say exactly where that is because it depends on, what items you're buying, what items you're selling. But my guess is that it's largely going to be a wash for these players. And then if you were selling gear, especially Raziel's gear, to buy other gear, your money is worth almost exclusively more. Again, it does depend if the bosses that you were killing, their average GP dropped by more than the basket of goods, then yeah, you're going to be making slightly less to way less money depending on the bosses. So because ambassador's money, for instance, like 98% of your money is from crossbow pieces. Yeah, if that's your favorite boss, your money is going down a little bit. Not by that much, but it is going down by a little bit. If you're doing Croesus, the overall money you're getting is way worse because, yeah, while the skilling drops went up, the armor drops dropped by more than 50%. Croesus is just worse now. There's no denying that. So yeah, I think that pretty much covers it. The TLDR is, generally speaking, for the average player, Necromancy's effects on the economy are either very positive or a wash. And for a niche number of players, it's pretty much always just worse. But this is for a group of players who I'm just not that interested if they're having a worse time. Players like me having less money to play with is probably fine. Like if a new thing comes out, I can just buy it. The fact that my money is a little bit less effective than it was before, it's probably good for you guys in all honesty. But yeah, that should be it for this video. I do plan on releasing another video soon about combat balance in general and why people still feel like Necromancy is broken, even though it's pretty clearly not. That video is coming out relatively soon, so expect that in a couple of days. But yeah, if you want to see more of these discussion type videos, then feel free to let me know in the comments. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.